Barrier, the managing partner. Today we have a very good friend of mine, Khadijah Tribble, who is the Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility for Cureleaf and also the founder of Marijuana Matters. She's someone who's a pioneer for Black women and people in general who are trying to come into the space and create real inclusion, real diversity, and real representation. So it's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be on. And
Okay.
congratulations. This is a great platform you're doing. This needs to be done. So thank you for doing it.
I appreciate that. It's really funny how we met because we're both from Alabama, and I had this exact hat on a few
Yeah.
months ago when I had a conversation with Al Harrington, and you had reached out to me. And from there, we just had a couple of really progressive conversations. So I'm really excited to have you on and share your story with the Black enterprise.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So I would love for you to give us an idea of, your education, your background, and what was your original passion once you kind of went into the professional space.
So I actually went to undergraduate school in Montevallo, Alabama.
Hmm.
Small little town, Alabama, little liberal arts school. And I majored in marketing. And so I had ideas that I would go and I would, be out there and be the first Black woman to head up major marketing companies for Coca-Cola. This is the early 90s. But that wasn't to be. As a matter of fact, individuals told me from the business school that perhaps I should try something different, maybe social work, because at the time at the University of Montevallo, NAFTA was big, and I kept trying to uh, situate this idea of business for good. Corporate social responsibility wasn't a thing back then. Um, I feel like I've come full circle. I am in a corporate cannabis space, and I'm still talking about how business can do good. Uh, a few years ago, I went to Harvard and decided that I wanted to tackle, in an academic sense, how can we actually leverage a social moment for the good of folks who have been criminalized, communities destroyed, right? And what we're talking specifically about is how can we actually legalize marijuana across the board in these states, in these jurisdictions, while Black and brown people are still being locked up for marijuana possession or use or distribution. It just didn't make any sense to me. And so when I decided that I wanted to uh, connect the dots between poverty and the collateral consequences related to a marijuana conviction, then I need to go to a place that would allow for me to explore those things. And so when I got accepted to the Kennedy School, I decided to make marijuana policy, social equity specifically, the thing that I focus on.
I want to ask you about something that I think people of color don't really pay a lot of attention to in the corporate space, in the cannabis space, I'm sorry. And that is the politics and the lobbying that goes on behind the scene that kind of structures the policy, the legalizations, and the parameters of how we can even get into cannabis. So what is that journey like, or what are those conversations like when you try to actually put forward a progressive legislation in front of our elected officials?
Right. So the fight for marijuana legalization obviously isn't new, right? It's been ever since it became illegal, people have been fighting to get it to become legal again. Just take a moment to acknowledge that we're in Pride Month and it's Juneteenth. And there's a lot of intersections for me personally as a woman of color, as a person that identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community, and someone who's working on cannabis, right? There's a lot of intersection there because one of the first notable medical marijuana provisions in the law came because a lot of activists in the LGBTQ community got together and pushed forward for Proposition 215. But to answer your question specifically, one of the things that I have found so interesting is that by the time the noise of legalization actually takes root and the media is paying attention in a particular state, there probably has been 2, 3, 4 years of lobbying to get legalization either on a ballot or for the legislature to actually take notice of it, right? And many times, communities that have been disproportionately disadvantaged by marijuana's prohibition are not even a part of the conversation. And so we have to recognize that however we feel about marijuana and the use of marijuana legalization is coming, and we better have had our say with what that means and how that impacts our community, which is precisely why I actually created Marijuana Matters, because I was very clear after the academic deep dive into policymaking and an understanding of what was happening in states like California that were on the forefront of legalization, decriminalization, and social equity language, that we had a lot of work to do. We had a lot of ground we needed to make up fast. And so, Marijuana Matters is situated at understanding that there's a role that community plays, and that is to get educated and be very clear about if marijuana comes to your community, what is the ask? What do you want legislators to do in support of communities that have been disproportionately harmed? What do you want those industry players that are coming to take up space to get licensed to cultivate, retail, and manufacture the product? What do you want them to know about the impact on your community? And then I think there's a role for government to play. Um, a lot of folks from communities that I worked in for years don't necessarily like when I say this particular point, but even though industry leaders today have a advantage as a result of marijuana's criminalization, they didn't necessarily create it, unless we're talking about some legislators who were part of it and now they're part of the cannabis community. But by and large, many of the folks that are part of the uh, regulated cannabis leadership aren't necessarily the same folks who actually were in government. So government role is very specific here. And I need us to be able to focus on what is the accountability of government who are going to be taking some of those revenue dollars. Where are you going to put those dollars? Not every state is being very specific. I mean, the fight in New York right now is very specific. The governor of New York does not want those tax dollars to go specifically to or to the I think the state legislature, which would have more impact on where those dollars go to communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. And so I think there's tons of space for us to get in and take a look at what is happening and then decide where are we best fit to make the most impact. Is it community? Is it government? Or is it in corporate cannabis?
Now that we've kind of had a little bit of a record, right? Certain states have legalized. I think we're at 11 recreational. What states do you feel like have done it the right way? And what does that look like? Like what is the effects that, because I think when states are going through the process of legalizing, they all say the right things, right?
Mhm.
But what states have actually applied the ideas and some of the rhetoric that they put out to even get legalization across the finish line?
So, I can't honestly say that there's any state that has gotten it right because the outcomes matter. You know, uh, whether you get there by referendum or whether you get there by the legislature in Vermont uh, matters not. What really matters is if the law is created with a social equity framework, meaning there's a clear understanding that we're going to legalize or decriminalize marijuana by centering those individuals who have had the most harm from its criminalization, then I think that is where we stand the best chance of creating a law and the execution of that law. Because, the state of Massachusetts and its leadership did a really, really good job with putting down specific things about what would happen as a result of legalization. You got a cannabis control commission that is fairly diverse. You have a champion there of social equity that said we needed to be able to prioritize individuals from communities that have been disproportionately impacted. And we would do that in a number of different ways. In Mass, they decided that they wanted to give exclusivity licenses to for delivery licenses to individual from the social equity community. They also put in place training, education, and dollars to support the members from the social equity community. However, those those dollars didn't come until after regulation and other MSOs were able to get in. So there's a, first to market advantage, right? That
Mm.
puts smaller players who don't necessarily have the capital or even the networks to be able to move at a significant disadvantage. We have in Illinois where they actually did the reverse of that. They put money in on the front end. They were going to stipulate specific number of licenses to the social equity community, but they also did not allow for individuals to have the right to grow their own marijuana. In DC, you have the right to grow your own marijuana. You don't necessarily have to go to a dispensary to consume. So there are pieces that every state that I think has gotten right, but no one has gotten it quite right because we don't have the outcomes.
I think you have an interesting perspective because you are now working with a multi-state operator yourself, such as Cureleaf. And I think a lot of people of color in the industry, we look at those from the outside, right? So now that you've kind of gotten acclimated to Cureleaf, kind of what is that experience working for one of these large players that happen to have so much influence in the space and the direction that cannabis goes?
I want to say honestly here, and I'm glad you asked this question. Um, we can create myths and then they become like legends. And it's not true. This is a company, it is a startup, and there's an opportunity for and there's space for people of color here at Cureleaf. I can emphatically say that if I thought that there was anything awry, that I would be gone by now. I've been here for 4 months and I am pleasantly surprised and energized, quite honestly, about what we're going to do with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Being able to work in the corporate social responsibility space is really a sweet spot for me because at the end of the day, this is a business, and so I don't see CSR as charity. I see it as social impact and doing good because one of the mottos, and I wish I'd come up with this, but I didn't, is that big cannabis can be good cannabis because being a good cannabis player is good business, right? And we've seen this in other sectors and other industries where people get and understand that their customers and their employees are happier and are more productive and are willing to spend more money with a company that actually cares about the work that they do in the communities that they serve. And Cureleaf, I think, is going to be the first MSO that actually puts a plan in place where we can actually realize that. And I tell everybody my credibility is on the line. I had a hypothesis that industry could do this and government could do that and community could do that. And so I went to the policy school to create a toolkit for government. I am happy to say that we are putting that toolkit in different jurisdictions across this country. And we've built Marijuana Matters to be the community arm of education, advocacy, and entrepreneurship. And now I am focused on the industry piece. So my hypothesis, I'm testing it out right now.
In a role that's not revenue driven. So what are some of your key performance indicators in your role to say, okay, I'm doing well alongside Cureleaf, or Cureleaf is doing well in this space? Like how do you kind of grade yourself?
We're actually putting the KPIs together right now. But I will say that there are some very specific things that I think there's no doubt about it. If you're trying to do CSR right in the cannabis space, you're going to have to take a look at the numbers of individuals from underrepresented communities inside of your organization who are in leadership positions. That's a given, right? And not just in cannabis, that's across the board. I mean, and another thing that we're taking a look at, social equity is a very, very near and dear to my heart. And so I fought really hard to make sure that it was a part of my portfolio and people understood that in order for us to have true corporate social responsibility, that we had to take a look at what was going on in the legacy market and what barriers are in place for folks who participated in that market to now join the regulated market. And not everybody's going to want to. And I'm not of the mindset that everybody should or will want to. But for those individuals, like my son's probably going to not be happy that I evoke him in this particular interview. But, he got into some trouble early on. And because of that trouble, he is not able to participate in the industry that he absolutely loves. And I mean, not just from the consumption side of it, from the business side of it, the idea that you can take a strand and create a whole brand, a whole culture, a whole movement around it is pretty spectacular. And watching him and his friends get in the lab and try to create what could be wealth generation for his sons, I think it's a travesty that he and his colleagues and his friends won't. There's no real clear pathway for them into the industry now. And we have to take a real look at that from a social equity standpoint. And my hope is that part of my KPIs will be judged by, making sure that we created lanes for individuals like him and his friends.
Love to have you follow up with that for our viewers who may not understand what social equity is or what that term means in cannabis. Could you give an explanation of that?
Sure. And so social equity isn't new, right? It's not specific to cannabis. It is quite honestly recognizing that there are individuals and community and people from underrepresented communities that have had a significant disadvantage through no fault of their own. They were born in a community, born in a particular race or a particular region that has disadvantaged them. And in this case, they've been disadvantaged because we have had a government sanctioned war on drugs. And I've said this before, in many cases, that meant a war on Black and Brown people. So, social equity in cannabis is specific to making sure that we right those wrongs, we acknowledge those wrongs, and we figure out a way to restore, reclaim, and repair the harms that were caused by the criminalization of marijuana. And specifically, I think the the collateral consequences that have come as a result of them. If someone has had an arrest on three different occasions over the course of say 3 or 4 years for marijuana possession, does that person really deserve to spend the rest of their life in jail? Really? Does that person, even if it's someone who had distribution charges, right? They did their time, they're out. Should that charge prevent them from being able to get education and training that allows for them to improve their lives or their condition? Should that charge really stay on their record that disqualifies them from being able to get a quality apartment, uh, bank loan, you name it? And at the end of the day, for this particular discussion, the question that I continuously ask: if someone has a marijuana arrest, conviction, or an incarceration, can they really not work in the industry? Can they not invest? Can they not be owners? What are we saying, really? And so, social equity is about that framework. It is about providing equal access to the outcomes and opportunities that legalization of marijuana presents.
Okay. And in the wake of, because that's a conversation, as you said, we've been having in cannabis for a while, right? But in the wake of the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, we're kind of having a more accountability conversation, right? I think it's kind of pivoted from just us having a discourse to now people are starting to hold companies accountable, especially within cannabis, right? Um, how do you think us as a culture should hold our cannabis companies accountable, and kind of what does that look like?
Well, I'm all about accountability for government officials. So, we have elections coming up. Pay attention to them. 2020 is a big election year. And 2022, quite honestly, is a big election year. We can't not hold, we have to hold all parts of this equation accountable. And we have to hold corporations and cannabis accountable as well. And the way that we do that, we have to be very clear about where we want to spend our dollars. People don't like boycotts. I think I was listening to somebody talk about boycotts on Twitter and how they're ineffective. We're from Alabama, and we know how effective boycotts. We just have to be committed to seeing it all the way through. And I think we're very clear. I am in my role at Cureleaf as head of CSR, that the consumers matter, our employees matter, and we are listening, we're paying attention. And to that end, we're putting together a very robust and aggressive strategy, um, and one that I hear people that we're taking a lot of heat because we aren't coming up with these flowery statements, and that's not to say the statements aren't important, right? Um, but I'm an action kind of girl, and I want us to do the right thing the right way. And part of, and you can appreciate this, Andrew, that sometimes when you are the first to do something, the scrutiny that you're under needs to be taken into account. And I want to make sure that whatever I am putting out on behalf of Cureleaf is going to be attainable, doable, and have the kind of social impact that I know we can make as an industry and as a company. And more specifically, we, the, we need to have the outcomes, right? We can say we want to do this and we support that, but if the numbers don't support it at the end of the work, then we've done all of this for nothing, right? The goal is to increase the diversity, equity, and inclusion of folk who are underrepresented in cannabis. How are we going to do that? Well, being very focused, we just launched our diversity, equity, and inclusion task force. It has been in the works. Actually, when I first came here, even before I came here, I was a consulting helping them formulate the strategy around that. And I'm happy to say we implemented, executed on the first phase of that. And uh, a significant number of people said, this is how I'm going to contribute to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the wake of what's happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Folks said, I am going to take the initiative inside my company to be a part of driving these initiatives. And the second thing I would like to say to that is, can we also hold ourselves accountable? Um, I talked to you a little bit about this on your drive to Louisiana, and if we have folk that are in positions that, if the desire is to create more leadership roles and for people of color, for women, and then a woman of color gets in that position, and the first thing you say is, oh, she's a token, then you devalue that right off the bat. Please don't do that to us. Let me have the opportunity to get in here and actually do the work that I'm committed to doing. And let's have a conversation. Let's talk, and let's keep the lines of communication open. So yeah, I'll say that.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, and you do a really good job of your answer leads me perfectly into the next thing I've been wanting to ask you. So I was doing a little bit of reverse research on your journey for our interview, and I noticed that you came on board at Cureleaf right around the time a lot of MSOs were going under. Like we see Acreage struggling, we see Canopy struggling. MedMen just had both of their founders step off of the board yesterday. So
Right.
what was the thought process for you to jump on to, because you said a few minutes ago that you put your reputation on the line by coming on board at a company such as Cureleaf. What did you see in them that made you say, okay, this company is worthwhile?
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to work with members of the leadership as a consultant, right? And where quite honestly, the very first conversation was very frank. Uh, there was something that was suggested, and I was like, "Well, that don't make any sense. How did you get there?" And they were like, "What do you mean?" And quickly, what they came to is like, "Oh, well, we answered this question or tried to create a solution for a pain point with just the people in this room, and the people in that room were not necessarily inclusive of all that I represent, right?" And so it dawned on them. It didn't take a lot for them to get there to understand, huh, we need other eyes and understanding and perspectives if we really want to make the kind of impact that we want to make. And so that started our conversation. And quite honestly, you know, I wrote an article that said that, we need a reparations fund. You know, that's pretty radical even today still. I mean, I think now people are talking about that and I'm obviously not the first person to write it. There are tons of people who have been putting forth this idea for a long time. But I saw cannabis legalization as a way to fund the 40 acres and a mule reparations fund. And I put it out there a few years ago. If and they and the leadership knows about that. And if they knew about that and they still wanted this activist, fight the power sister that was in 1980s talking about divest from from companies that refuse to leave and out of South Africa, then they were serious about making the kind of impact. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to call you bluff. You're serious? Let's see. Um, and they're serious.
And I'll ask you a similar question that I asked Erica Pittman a few weeks ago.
I love that interview, by the way.
Yeah, she's really bright. She was
Oh, she's so dope.
one of the best conversations I've ever had in my life. I asked her what's that process of, because she's a CMO, so she has to figure out a way to sell her idea internally, right? To get approval or get collaboration to project it out into the consumer. So what's that process for you internally to get an idea together, an initiative together before you're able to take it out to the masses?
Yeah. I'll give a shout out to Jason White, who was our CMO, who really has been instrumental in helping me adopt an understanding and a language of how you put together your ideas, your thoughts in a way in which it is. If I said it wasn't charity, then why would I present it as charity, right? And so, what are the business cases for this? And so, he has been instrumental in helping me be able to formulate an understanding of how to situate this work in a way in which there is a business imperative, which I understand, but what are the numbers say? You're right. And what are the things that we need to consider? Not all things can be done by Cureleaf, right? There's a role that Cureleaf can play. And part of what I've been doing these last few months is really understanding the capacity. And I'll just when I was at the Kennedy School, I took a negotiations class. Um, I really hated that class until I left, and I was reading books again. I was like, oh, I need to go back and revisit some things because in the art of negotiation, you need to understand what the capacity is, right? If you ask over the capacity, then you will not be able to deliver any of the things that you want to have happen. Same thing if you ask beneath the capacity. And so, if, I'm not saying this specific to Cureleaf, but if the industry and the association can actually respond financially to a donation to a social justice fund at 1,000,005, but we asked for 750, then what have we done? If we haven't done the due diligence to really research what the opportunity is, what the capacity is. And so that's what I've done over the last few months. And I am really excited about the package that we are actually presenting in a couple of weeks to our final uh, hurdle, if you will. So thanks for asking the question. But yeah, I think you have to get the folks who understand to inform your process. And that's what I've done with Jason. And he's been very good to helping me understand it.
Another question I would love to have your insight on, because you study the industry very closely, right? And I think over the past year, the outlook on cannabis has changed, right? This time last year was a green rush. All these companies were supposed to be the Amazon of cannabis or the Apple of cannabis. And now institutional money isn't flowing in how it was. Projections fell well short. So what do you think moving forward is going to be the direction cannabis needs to go to actually reach sustainability, to really show that it's going to be the major industry people thought that it was going to turn into, legally at least, because it's already a major industry, but in the
Right.
legal market?
Well, there are a couple of ways to think about it. Whenever you have a state by state market, you have more money that you have to expand, right? If you can't centralize your grow and you can't centralize your processes, every state is regulating it so differently. Um, so I think in order for us to really see the full uh, maturation of the industry, we need a federally legalized state. That's from the business side of it, in my opinion. But I also think that we have to have a diversity of business models that actually create on ramps from the open market, because quite honestly, you know, if individuals have been securing uh, their products in an open market that's an unregulated market or the legacy market, then how are you honestly going to get those dollars to come inside of the regulated space? And I don't think we are doing a good enough job at creating those on ramps for the consumers or for the producers that are in that market, right? And so I think we have to begin to think about using our social equity framework, coming up and being really creative about how we actually create and expand a regulated market that is inclusive of folks from the legacy market, their consumers, as well as the makers, the producers, because you know there's some interesting things that are going on in that space, and I don't suspect that it's going to stop anytime soon without federal legalization and the ability to on ramp those folks. So those are
Okay.
my thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I'm going to ask you a question that I get asked every day, and I'm sure you get asked often. People of color often ask me, how do I get into the space? Oh, I hear my state's about to legalize. I want to have a dispensary. I want to have a grow. What do you say to aspiring entrepreneurs who are interested in coming into the space but don't really know exactly how or what they're in for?
Um, so right off the bat, do your due diligence. If you are in a state that hasn't legalized already and somehow you think it's happening, it may be happening. Go find out who's doing the work. Get involved on the legislative front because you need to understand how the laws are going to be written, who's going to own that space. The medical market, depending on where you are, could be the Department of Health, could be your alcohol and um, bureau. So you have to be clear and understand kind of what phase you're in. And I will say, don't be afraid to reach out to people on LinkedIn. I mean, now you just put in cannabis and you'll see who folks are. Be wary, do your due diligence because everybody that's in cannabis is not really in cannabis. Um, but begin to reach out. Do not be afraid. If you're serious about it, then you need to begin to talk to people. You can just show up at events. You need to know who is doing what in your area. And if you live in a state that is not close to legalization and you want to own a dispensary, you might have to move. Don't be afraid to move. Sometimes you have to transport yourself and put yourself in the best situation to be successful. And the final thing, if you're going to be in the regulated space, go ahead and get your money up. Um, if you're trying to be in this space, it requires a lot of money and capital, and figure out how to get your money up. And I tell people all the time, I give uh, I'll talk to anyone for 15 minutes to just, connect and see if I have a resource to connect you to or someone to network you with. I will not withhold information because it's too critical for folks. We have to be able to connect with each other and make sure. So reach
And that's
out.
powerful given your position. A lot of entrepreneurs who are in the space, they look at a Cureleaf or a Canopy and they're like, man, maybe I can get an investment from them or maybe I can partner with them. What advice would you give to a underfunded entrepreneur on how they could better position their company to raise money if they're already in the space?
Um, so I get this question actually a lot. And let me get two things. I said this when I was doing a talk with Uplift a couple of weeks ago. Um, if you do not have a business plan, do not reach out and say you have a business proposition and you don't have anything to show for it. Because my next email is, okay, let's talk. But when we talk and you're just in the ideation stage, there are opportunities. You have to be in a position to take advantage of them, and not everyone is. That doesn't mean you have to stop, but you can't, if the resource is there to connect you with opportunity, be ready for the opportunity. And I'm saying to people they should get ready, and they should reach out. I'm I am someone who is open to figuring out how we can help as many people as we can possibly help. And I won't be able to help everyone, but I don't know until that conversation is had. And for those folks who are in this space already and they're looking to connect with Cureleaf and potentially look at partnership opportunities, we are figuring out what our capacity is. Reach out.
What are some really effective resources or platforms you've been able to follow for information such as Marijuana Matters, maybe MCBA? What platforms would you recommend to Black entrepreneurs that actually give out really good comprehensive information?
Right. Of course, I'm going to shout out Marijuana Matters. Our team is really building, and we're going to have you on hopefully, uh, building out the education platform. We call it We Crush. They call it We Crush Wednesdays, where they actually take people who have information and share it with folks who are looking for information. I also think that Roz, Minorities for Medical Marijuana, is, have you talked to Roz yet?
Not yet, but I'm going to get her on soon. She's on
Yeah.
our she's
She's
on
on
our
your list,
to-do
yeah.
list. Yeah, yeah.
She's just a real committed, hardworking sister, and I just
Mhm.
think that her platform is,
And
she has
she's honest,
legitimate information.
not to cut you off, but I think
No,
a big problem that we had was everyone tried to position it like a green rush, like, oh, you're going to make $1 million in 6 months or 12 months. I think people need realistic information and ideas about what's actually going to happen once you step into cannabis, because a lot of people get a rude awakening when they come in here and realize that capital is just not falling from the sky, especially for Black people. So
mhm,
I think her platform is really powerful in that sense.
right. Um, and my MCBA is has a platform. I'm not sure, you know, I have to get a little bit clear about the direction that MCBA is going in. I used to think that they were an advocacy organization, and I still think that they do adequate advocacy work in terms of entrepreneurship and training and stuff like that. I'm not really sure, but I will say Kevin Ford over at Uplift, reach out to that brother. To hear who is at NCIA. Um, there are uh, there are a significant number of us who are now making inroads into these larger associations, larger organizations, and that this is the opportunity to coalesce around one another, connect. Akili out of Illinois, a young brother from Alabama, uh, and doing really, really good big things in Illinois and in the equity fight. I know they were able to secure the first ever community benefit agreement from a large operator, which is significant. It's actually something in our toolkit for Marijuana Matters that we talk about a lot. Um, but yeah, so information is out there, and there are people out there. Can Inclusive Mary Pryor is doing some stuff, and I want to give a shout out to the folks at the Possible Plan as well. That's Jason's organization that focuses on expungement and second chances. So there are a lot of folks out there doing some significantly good work.
Okay, thank you. How do you feel? What does federal legalization need to look like? Because I asked Tucky Blunt, he was the first equity owner in Oakland, and he said he wasn't excited about federal legalization because he feels like the verbiage in it isn't gonna benefit Black people, and just tobacco and alcohol is just gonna run in and just own everything. So how do you feel federalization needs to look for it to even be beneficial for people like us?
Yeah, I think that it needs to be decriminalized with the social equity lens first, to be honest. If we're looking at it from the standpoint of um, how it can most benefit individuals who have been harmed by war on drugs, legalization is just not going to help that. It's what he said is spot on, and we quite honestly aren't organized enough across the nation. We're getting there. There are conversations being had, and I think our elected officials need to understand and be willing to fight for strong social equity language. They have to be. And if that means that we don't legalize it, then that just means we don't legalize it.
because obviously we now have Biden versus Trump, right, heading into the November election. Who did you feel like was the best candidate that would have legalized cannabis federally and had the best plan of action around it? Do you feel like anyone actually was a good
Of the
candidate in that sense?
Democrats or
Yeah,
between Biden and, I
but
mean,
between the
yeah, the
Democrats.
Democrats, the person that vocalized the most progressive was obviously Bernie Sanders, you know. But I think, you know, Bernie Sanders' rhetoric is problematic in other ways. It's like, okay, you believe that we should legalize it with this framework, but how are you going to do it? And I know he said an executive order, but then how do we make sure that the states actually implement the way, you know? So there's a lot of gray area in there for me. But, you know, on paper, I mean, you know, in terms of the talking points, he had the most progressive ideas, you know. And then Cory Booker, who is the senator that put forth the marijuana, what, I can't even remember what it's called, but it is the most progressive, I think, set of tools that any legislator has put forth that speaks to the marijuana social justice act. But it's not even strong enough. I feel like there needed to be some more meat and potatoes. I think if we're going to talk about what the government is going to do, then I really think that, you know, this is the time to ask for the specific percentage that will go to a social justice reparations fund that specifically addresses the collateral consequences and helps to reverse them, because those are significant. You know, I gave a TED talk, and in the TED talk, I talked about being the daughter, a part of a generation that was supposed to realize the full benefit of the civil rights struggle, right? The Voting Rights Act, our education, equal education, fair housing, equal opportunities on our job, right? So those are like four major pieces of civil rights legislation that my generation was supposed to be able to take advantage of. And when you look at the collateral consequences associated with a conviction for drug possession, they strip you of your voting rights, right? They make it hard for you now, or it makes it okay to discriminate against you for fair housing opportunities. It allows people to discriminate and deny you an opportunity to actually get a decent job, and in some cases, cosmetology licenses or anything else, right? So, so I have a marijuana arrest for possession, and now I can't be a cosmetologist. Come on, right? And so, and then education and training, you can lose access to, you know, Pell Grants and other financial aid opportunities because you have an arrest or conviction related to marijuana. Like, come on. It was so blatant to me when I started looking. I was like, oh, these were the things that were to help our community elevate out of poverty, right? And then you add these things and you criminalize something, and then you add these collateral consequences, they cancel the progress out. And that's, you know, African Americans were richer and then they had more wealth in the 70s than they have now.
And
How?
do you think Biden's VP choice will have any consequence on cannabis legislation moving forward?
You know, I think, and this is what I've said to activists, you know, you might not like Biden, but if he is the nominee, then you need to get in there and make sure he is clear about where we stand on marijuana legalization. We care not what you think. Here's what you need to do in order to earn our vote. Because you want to be the president. If you want to be the president, here are the issues that we care about, and here's how we want you to understand and make those issues real for us, right? This is how we expect you to do it. I, that's what organizing and mobilization does, right? You raise the issue and you force their hand at creating a policy that works for you. They need your vote. Period. He needs your vote.
Yeah, seems to be the most consequential election of our lifetime. But every election feels like that, but this time for real. So
This one feels pretty pretty big
right.
for
Okay.
sure.
So that's it. I appreciate you coming on. Your insight
Thank
is
you.
definitely valuable to everyone who's both within cannabis and who wants to get into the space. Is there anywhere on social media that you would like our viewers to go to continue to follow your story?
So go to Marijuana Matters DC on Instagram. I'm making my Instagram private in a little bit. I made it was private, and then I made it public during the George Floyd murder, and because I wanted to be a little bit more public about what I was feeling, and I didn't want to be stifled by just my position. And so Tribble me on Twitter is where you can find me, and Marijuana Matters DC is where you can stay connected to the work. Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you. Thank you. I appreciate you, Andrew. Good luck.